Welcome to Part 3, the final installment of the story about Ronald Braunstein and Caroline Whiddon. In many hours of talking with Ronald, he told me a ton of strange and wild stories. One of them spawned an image in my mind that was so vivid, it just stuck. But I was never able to find a place for it in the story. Until now. It began with Ronald going for a walk in a giant cemetery across the street from where he lived.
But after maybe 10 or 20 minutes of walking, I realized I had no idea how to get out.
He was lost. Remember how Ronald had to follow a friend to elementary school every day? Or how he couldn't recall the way back to his apartment in Vermont, even though he was just a block away and could actually see the building? This is not some lack of focus. It's a bona fide neurological deficit, the kind of thing Oliver Sacks would have written up. As a result, at this moment, he was hopelessly lost. This would cause many of us to become anxious, to panic, or even call the cops. Ronald, his response was to begin conducting.
It was Mahler First Symphony, the bass solo. I was just, dee-ro, dee-ro-rim, dee-ro-dee-ro-rum, yum-ba-dum-bim-bum.
So there's a full orchestra blaring Mahler 1 in his head, and he's conducting this invisible orchestra in full view of the outside world with staggering intensity. But if you had been standing off in the distance that day, all you would have actually witnessed was a thin man with salt and pepper hair strangely waving his hands and humming to himself amidst an endless sea of tombstones. It would look, well, crazy. And in a way, this was Ronald's life. From the outside, it looked off and discordant. On the inside, it was something rich and euphonic. But in 2011, the dissonance between his inner life and outer life was crushing him. In fact, the anguish was so unbearable that he made a secret plan to end his life. What he didn't know was that a toss-off comment was about to get him to do something that had never been done before.
I was sitting in the car on the way home, and I thought, wow, that is a great idea.
This is Brain Stories, a show about one of the most bewildering mysteries of the human experience, mental illness, told by people who live with it and those who support them. I'm your host, Frank Kosa. At the end of January 2011, Ronald Braunstein was completely enveloped in darkness. He had been fired from the Vermont Youth Orchestra Association just days after staff learned the one thing he didn't want the world to know, that he lived with bipolar disorder.
Everyone knew that I was, mentally ill and to be avoided and mistrusted.
His career in music was over. He was never going to conduct again. He would never again do what he loved, what he lived for. So he made the plan of the hopeless, to end his life.
I went and scouted the exact place when I was going to do this.
I felt his desperation.
That's Caroline Whiddon, the executive director of the youth orchestra. She and Ronald had become quite close.
And I definitely thought it was possible that I was going to lose him at any moment.
But two things happened very quickly after Ronald's final day at the Vermont Youth Orchestra. First, Ronald and Caroline finally acted on feelings that had been smoldering for months. She had resigned from the youth orchestra in October, well before Ronald was fired. So it was a coincidence. But her last day on the job was the very same as Ronald's.
It wasn't until about 2 weeks after we were both completely unemployed, that I would say I made my move.
she made me feel secure because she really knew who I was and she accepted it. And that level of security changed me forever.
I was able to give him the kind of attention and kind of the 24/7 support that I think pulled him out of any thoughts of harming himself at that point. Sure, I'll give myself credit for that. Why not?
The second thing that happened was an idea that was equal parts brilliant and crazy. Ronald was at a friend's place one day and in a world of pain about never working in music again. In response, his friend tried to make a joke.
And he said, well, listen, why don't you go, make your own orchestra? An orchestra for people with bipolar disorder. Yeah, it really was a quip. But as soon as I heard it, I thought, wow, that is a great idea.
Ronald instantly recognized it as a way back into music, maybe the only way back in. So he went straight to the one person who could actually help him pull it off.
And he walked into my living room and said, I got a great idea for us.
Caroline loved the thought of getting Ronald back in front of an orchestra. But this kind of orchestra? She had never heard of anything like it. And that was scary. Because she knew that trailblazing ideas mostly just went down in flames. She began scouring the internet for anything like this that already existed. There could be a model for how to do it.
I didn't find anything like that. And that was terrifying.
Finally, she came across the gay men's choir movement that had started in San Francisco in 1978.
And that gave me hope because it was one example of people who had been ostracized by their community and they got together and they made great music and it made things a little bit better.
As she continued digging, she found that many great social movements in the last 60 years had music at the forefront. That was somewhat inspiring.
But not too much, because I still wasn't really thinking of this as a social movement. This was a how do we get Ronald back on the podium movement.
But Ronald was only going to get back on the podium if they could attract enough musicians to make an orchestra.
And I said, okay, well, does everybody have to have bipolar disorder in this orchestra? And I said, Ronald, there's not that many people here. We have more cows than we do humans in Vermont.
But as they began hammering the idea out, they realized that the issue really wasn't numbers. It was about not creating silos.
I had been told by one of our colleagues a few months earlier that they thought Ronald had a mental illness and they didn't know how to work with that. And that statement stung so much so that when Ronald said, I want to start a new orchestra, I thought it's got to include people with and without a diagnosis so that we can demonstrate to people who think that they don't know how to work with someone who has bipolar disorder that they're wrong. And I thought, damn it, we're going to create an orchestra and show everybody how it's done.
With that, the Getting Ronald Back on the Podium movement launched. But they faced a mountain of obstacles. The first was money. The typical starting price of an orchestra? Small fortune. Ronald and Caroline barely had 2 sticks to rub together.
I sold my condo, I liquidated my retirement account, I sold my car, and moved into his crappy apartment across town.
It was a massive risk, but Caroline didn't even blink.
I remember the day I liquidated my retirement account, I just thought, oh God, I hope I don't regret this. I really hope I don't regret this. And yet it also was just, this is what I'm going to do, because the alternative is what? Ronald never works again. I mean, there was no alternative except to support.
All in.
Except to be all in, yeah.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
By the summer, they had created budgets, formed a board, and completed the paperwork to set up the orchestra. What they needed was a name. Ronald proposed Me Too.
And as soon as I said that, Caroline said, okay, yeah, Me Too. Music for mental health.
This was years before the Me Too movement against sexual harassment became high profile. But the name was based on a similar response that Ronald often got as he began speaking openly about living with a mental illness.
And every so often you'd say it's an orchestra for people with mental illness, and then there'd be a pause. Then they say, well, Actually, me too. I have a mental illness.
In September, they set a date for their very first rehearsal, which they announced in their first press release.
Wednesday, September 7th, 2011. A new classical music ensemble, Me Too Orchestra, is being launched this month to serve individuals.
For the first time in his musical career, Ronald was fully public about his mental illness.
Of Me Too Orchestra. Braunstein was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 1985.
They kept the idea simple. The primary mission was to play music. There was no requirement to disclose or even discuss mental illness. And the most attractive element of all, no auditions. Almost all orchestras have an audition barrier. It's a nerve-wracking evaluation to see if you're good enough to become a member. Me Too's policy was to accept any musician wherever they were, musically and mentally. The concept seemed solid, but now the invitation was out, and the clock began ticking.
The hardest part was then waiting to see if anybody would respond to it at all. But one by one, we got emails from people that said, yeah, so this sounds like it's for me, and here's why. Here's my diagnosis. And I just felt so, not so much relieved as just honored that people would write to us and share private information because they'd read an article in the paper where they saw that they were going to be promised a safe place.
In total, they got about a dozen emails. It was a harrowingly small number for an orchestra. But 2 of those emails came from people Caroline knew, young adults who had been in the Vermont Youth Orchestra years before.
Both with bipolar disorder. And I'm going, wow, 6 months ago, I didn't think that I knew anybody with bipolar disorder. Ronald was the first person in my life to ever disclose that to me. And now suddenly, immediately out of the gate, I've got 2 kids that I've known for years who are saying, yeah, me too.
The day of the first rehearsal arrived. Caroline had arranged for a room in a community center where the decor was Spartan and the lighting scant. But the place was free. Ronald and Caroline got there early and began to wait, anxiously.
I mean, we had to be worried about it, right? There's never been a mental health orchestra. So even people, it was easy for people to express some interest via email, but are they literally going to physically show up at the door?
Slowly, people did come through the door, eventually reaching a grand total of 7. But the awkwardness was stifling.
And they were all sitting in a line against the wall, and no one was really looking at each other from side to side, just kind of frozen. And I invited everyone just to sit down on the floor and change the mindset that whatever you thought you were getting into, well, it would be something perhaps uncharted.
Instead of music, Ronald began with a conversation. He spoke about his own experience with mental illness.
After a while, people started trusting each other with their secrets.
It was a beginning. But when the second rehearsal came, attendance dropped to 4. The third meeting, not many more. Ronald had never dealt with anything like this in his life.
I conducted a concert at Juilliard called the Alpen Symphony by Richard Strauss. And there are a lot of instruments, it calls for about 80 instruments. And I would not start the concert until the third clarinet was there. It was that kind of thing that I was used to.
And I remember looking at you every single week and going, honey, I've only heard from 5 people. We're going to have 3 horns, 1 viola, and a bass player. How do you make music with such an odd group?
You work with who's there, who shows up, and I fill in the missing instruments in my brain, and it will be good enough.
If Ronald could conduct an invisible orchestra in the cemetery, filling in 25 missing parts, no problem.
I was concentrating more on how lovely it was to be joyful and happy about who was there rather than who was not there.
As the months rolled by, a small core of musicians became regulars.
It didn't increase in size for a while, but the kernel of the group had been formed. And then, little by little, people heard about it.
One of the first pieces they rehearsed was from the composer who was, as Ronald once put it, his man.
We started playing a Beethoven piece Coriolan overture. The whole idea is a horizontal note and then a vertical note. So it sounds like bum. We must have done that 100 times. And then someone said, I think it was Caroline, you said, should we work toward a concert?
Orchestras typically exist to perform. But with Me Too, every page of the playbook was up for debate.
I can't stress enough how much we were making this up as we went along.
Especially when it came to being upfront about mental illness.
I'd just been through this period of time with Ronald where I couldn't get him to talk about having a diagnosis. And these were people that in some cases we were meeting for the first time, and I didn't know if it was even fair to ask them to kind of be out in the public in the quote-unquote mental health orchestra.
This is when Mark Lawrence spoke up. Mark was one of the early emailers who Caroline knew from the Vermont Youth Orchestra, a classically trained clarinetist and a part-time rapper. He was usually Mr. Laid Back. Not this time.
Mark raised his hand and just, he just looked at me like it was the silliest thing. He said, well, of course, we've got to perform. How else are we going to fight stigma? And that was our green light to then go ahead and actually think about performing.
So 3 months after the first time they'd ever assembled, the Me Too Orchestra premiered. Never mind that its members were few. Tickets were free. And the program consisted of precisely 2 pieces.
We're having our holiday concert and inviting the public into our kind of dank and dark rehearsal studio, but it was great.
When the program was over, one member of the audience rose to his feet and shouted praise.
One of the leaders in Vermont's mental health scene was there, and I'll never forget him saying, this is one of the best stigma-fighting ideas I've ever witnessed. Open up your wallets. And I was like, oh, thank you, thank you.
The first concert inspired hope, but the viability of the orchestra could not have been less certain.
The first 3 years of this felt pretty shaky to me.
I think I was in such a panic mode that was so consistently stressed out that I didn't even know I was stressed out.
Give me the list, a bullet point list of all the things that were stressing you out for those 3 years.
Money, Ronald's mental health, and then Ronald's mental health.
Now, the orchestra and Ronald's relationship with Caroline had done a lot to lift his despair. And he was working with a great psychiatrist.
But he was also still, kind of teetering above and below the balanced place.
It didn't help that life was hard in almost every other way. Starting with the daily regimen in Burlington, a small city where there was no escaping painful reminders.
Like every time we left the house, we were afraid that we were going to run into somebody that had been involved in some way in the ugliness, in the dark period. I didn't want to think about it every time I went to the grocery store. It was exhausting.
I was still reeling from being fired.
He was surviving off of unemployment, and that required him to submit job applications every week, as if Burlington had tons of openings for conductors. And more than anything, the orchestra's existence was so precarious.
Trying to get this thing up off the ground just seemed backbreaking and in every possible way. We were under a lot of stress.
But Me Too gave him a secret weapon, something he'd never had in his life before: openness.
I just felt that I could be myself and relax about it and not feel like I had something to hide. And that took an enormous amount of pressure off of me.
So Ronald and Caroline kept putting one foot in front of the other. They began planning a second concert, which raised a bigger question. Where was an orchestra like this going to play? Big concert halls were out. That required an ability to fill a house that Me Too simply didn't have. So the orchestra began booking the most unsymphonic spaces: gyms, prisons, a juvenile detention center. Unintentionally, they became guerrilla warriors of classical music, taking it places where live music was never seen, which got them some attention.
Welcome to Stuck in Vermont. My name's Ava Solberger. We're here in South Burlington at the Burlington International Airport. And Me Too Orchestra is playing here.
It even helped with the funding. A little. But as the Me Too Orchestra got out there, one question kept coming up, especially from funders.
I get the idea. I understand the mission, but what are you doing to keep people safe at your rehearsals?
The first time Caroline heard the question, she was surprised.
Naive to think that wouldn't be in somebody's mind. But, we'd had a few rehearsals at that point, and I just said, that's not a problem we're having.
One big factor was having a conductor who understood his orchestra from his own experience. It's hard to overstate how game-changing that was.
I can see how a musician is doing from the minute he walks in the room. Ones that are not doing that well, I can kind of zoom in on them and help them.
This was not to say that things didn't happen in the Me Too rehearsals that never happened in other orchestras, or at least would never have been tolerated.
The scariest couple of episodes that we've had in rehearsals involved, I think, us being afraid for someone who was dissociating in the moment and being afraid for them, not for us.
In one rehearsal, near the end, a string player began to moan as if she was in pain. The moment the rehearsal was over, Caroline checked in.
Now, this is someone that I had known for many months. She was standing at her case, putting away her instrument, and I said, "How are you doing?" And she looked at me, and I immediately knew that she had no idea who I was. I thought, okay, I need to introduce myself. And so I put out my hand and said, "I'm Caroline. I'm not sure if we've met." And she looked at me and in a very friendly voice introduced herself to me, but she did not use her name. She was someone else in that moment.
She sounded like a timid young girl. Caroline just went with it.
I said, "Well, I'm so glad that you're here at rehearsal, and I hope it was good for you. Could I help you go home?" And she said, "Yeah, that would be really great."
So Caroline got her in the car, and they headed to the woman's apartment. Now, Caroline had some idea of what to expect because the woman had told her.
We had coffee a few weeks before because she said she wanted to talk to me. And she explained to me that she can take on different personalities.
But that didn't quite prepare Caroline for what happened next.
Over the course of that ride, she was telling me all about her life. And of course, it was not a life that I recognized as being hers. It turned out she was channeling her, I think, like an 8-year-old Japanese girl. And she actually started to write in characters in her diary in the car. And then I remember she looked at her schedule and she said, "This says I have to work tomorrow, but how could I have to work? I'm just an 8-year-old girl."
Caroline got the woman safely back into her apartment. The next morning, she called to see if she was okay. The woman had no memory of the previous night, but she wasn't the least surprised.
She said, "Oh, yeah, you met one of my personalities." And she said, "Yeah, I'm fine."
That wasn't the last time she dissociated, but it simply became part of regular life, the Me Too culture.
She came to trust me, which is just so amazing to me, that she felt safe enough with me that if I could see that she was losing touch with our current shared reality, I could go over to her and she would walk out with me and we would sit until she felt safe enough to return.
Incidents like this didn't happen often, but in an orchestra that was expressly of people with mental illness and those who support them, it was part of the landscape. So Ronald and Caroline came to expect the occasional divergent reality.
A young bass player came to me at the end of a rehearsal and explained to me that there were gremlins who had come out of the heating grates in the building where we were rehearsing and had gotten into her bass.
And then there was the evening when an oboe player was having a hard time.
She seemed like she was not in good shape. She seemed very angry and she seemed very miserable.
You and she have a special connection. Some of the musicians will come to me if they're having a bad day, but some of them will come to you.
So I went up to her and I said, "How are you doing? What's up with you?"
The woman became agitated, like she was about to collapse or explode, or both.
So I said, come with me. So I took her out the door, and she was suddenly just really, really upset.
She tore off down the hall and vanished into the darkness. Ronald swiftly told his intern to start rehearsal and got Caroline. They began scouring the building, terrified, not that the woman was going to hurt someone, but that she might hurt herself.
And we went looking for her and eventually found her huddled in a corner in a dark classroom. And at that point, I don't know, we looked at each other and I said, I've got it. So you went back and took over the rehearsal, and I sat with her and we cried.
There are clinical terms for moments like these. Things like mood dysregulation or hallucinations. The terms can be useful, but they can also be slapped on without any meaningful understanding. Apart from the phrase bipolar disorder, I never heard Ronald or Caroline use this kind of language. And with good reason. They weren't clinicians. But they had a tremendous ability to deliver something really basic that was exactly what people needed.
It's hard to just remember to shut up and just be there. Put your arm around someone. That's what we have learned over and over again with Me Too, is that there's so much power in just being with someone.
Outbursts like those would have caused chaos in an ordinary orchestra. People would have been kicked out, or worse. Ronald and Caroline never called the cops, or anyone else, because they didn't respond with fear. The real menace to the Me Too orchestra was not mental illness. It was money. 2 years into it, Ronald and Caroline were worse than broke.
I mean, we were heavily in debt.
Strange things happen when couples run out of money. And so it was, late one night when Ronald and Caroline were in another tense conversation about finances. Something just clicked for Ronald.
She just looked so beautiful.
He rose abruptly, went to a drawer in the next room, and fished out a $29 ring he'd purchased. This is the man who had lost his hotel room key a dozen times in just 2 days. But he had no trouble remembering exactly where he'd put this ring.
She was in the kitchen in her bathrobe. I went down on my knee and I asked her, would you marry me? In our horrible kitchen.
Caroline was a little surprised.
And you said,
Are you kidding me? And you said, no, of course I'm not kidding. I said, okay.
So I said, so let's go down to City Hall tomorrow. It's supposed to be a really nice day out. We'll stop by a floral shop and we'll get I'll get you a rose and we'll just do it.
And I said, well, tomorrow's April 15th and I don't want my anniversary to always be on tax day.
So on April the 16th, 2 days after the proposal, they strolled into City Hall to see the Justice of the Peace.
She met us in the lobby and she said, okay, well, so how do you want to handle this? And I said, well, we just want to be married. She said, are there vows or is there anything you want to say to each other? We just looked at each other and I think I said to her something like, you have no idea what the last 2 years have been like. There's nothing more to be said.
They signed marriage papers, got a couple of photos with their cell phones, and went home.
I had you and a mattress on the floor in a crappy apartment, a rice cooker, a
coffee maker,
nice coffee maker. I mean, I was happy. I was stressed out, but I was happy.
I feel like my life began when I met Caroline. Everything before that, it was just all bad.
Together, they added to the number of musicians. They scraped up enough money to get through each week. And brick by painstaking brick, they built the orchestra's reputation. Failure never seemed far away, but they managed to keep it from coming through the door. And bit by bit, they willed their dream of Me Too into existence.
There was never a plan B. I don't know, can you be in sort of a traumatized state for like 3 years where you're so full of love and stress and how are we going to do this that you just don't even have room for
Doubt.
The idea that it would not happen.
By 2014, The Burlington Orchestra was stable enough that Ronald and Caroline began thinking of a second orchestra in a new city. They decided on Boston. It was a drivable distance that would allow them to commute and keep Burlington going. They figured they'd started one orchestra. A second would be easy. They soon learned that almost everything about that was wrong.
It was Vermont all over again. I mean, you write the press release, you put the word out, you find a little church to rehearse in, and 6, 7, 8 people show up at the first rehearsal.
For their one night a week in Boston, they secured a spare room in a triple-decker in Melrose. The best thing about it was free. Unfortunately, the room had no heat, a mattress of uncertain origins, and some uninvited roommates.
And I swear there were mice.
There were mice.
Yeah, in the middle of the night, you'd hear them. And I don't think I slept more than a couple of hours.
Nevertheless, month by month, rehearsal after rehearsal, the orchestra grew. They continued to play venues no one else played, and continued to operate like classical music guerrillas, bringing traditional music to untraditional spaces. That included the Middle of South Station, Boston's bustling train center, Bridgewater State, a mental hospital for the incarcerated, and the Engagement Center, where clients were welcomed in whatever state they were in, often high on opiates or heroin.
The first time I was just terrified. I mean, there are all these people who are obviously really strung out.
But it turned out they were the perfect orchestra for that community, and vice versa. They returned several times. And one time, Ronald even offered a conducting masterclass for anyone in the audience who wanted to try being on the podium.
The staff told us on the way out that they were so amazed by a couple of the people who had volunteered to get up and conduct, because they've never seen them really kind of connect in quite that way especially with outsiders.
There was a lot of appreciation, but it was a two-way street.
Also, it made it very clear to me how thin the line was between being in a mental hospital / prison and where we are.
After a few years, Boston and Vermont were up and at least viable. And there was talk of a third orchestra starting in New Hampshire. So one day, Caroline asked Ronald, if you could do anything you wanted in the world, what would you do next?
He said, well, I know what I want to do. I want to play at Boston Symphony Hall. And it was another one of those moments where I'm like, oh, okay, deep breath. Here we go.
Boston Symphony Hall is one of the premier concert halls in the United States and one of the best acoustically in the world. But they had come a very long way since 7 nervous musicians responded to the first press release. And by now, the 10th anniversary of the orchestra was approaching. Was there a better way to market? But that came with a scary question. If they did perform in this large and fabled hall, would anyone show up?
Hi, I'm the leader of the group that's about to arrive in a half hour. The Me Too group, yeah.
It's January 23rd, 2022, and Caroline has just arrived at Boston Symphony Hall.
I'm Caroline Whiddon.
She's wearing a mask. Everyone will. It's the middle of a COVID surge that nearly canceled the whole event. Anywhere the orchestra rehearses or plays, one of the very first things Caroline does is put up a sign. The sign reads, "You are entering a stigma-free zone."
Stigma-free zones are not something that exist readily in our society, even in the places where you would think they would exist, like within, everybody's family or a doctor's office.
To outsiders, stigma-free may sound like a catchphrase or political correctness, but to orchestra members, it's a welcome sign.
Performance that it really changes their, switches their level of anxiety so they can actually kind of go, oh yeah, safe space, relax.
Just after 12 noon, the bus pulls up to the musicians' entrance of Symphony Hall.
We're going to get out on the other side, which is weird. Yay! Thank you for...
It carries musicians from 3 states, because by now there are Me Too orchestras in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. They'll be joining the Boston Orchestra for a Me Too Palooza. Invoking the 60s, Ronald calls it a happening. There is no doubt that countless people living with mental illness have played on this stage before. But this is the first time that an orchestra will perform here that is saying it out loud. And the rehearsal begins.
1,
The next day is performance day. Musicians, now in the black and white of formal dress, warm up again. In the halls, Caroline gives ushers some final instructions.
There is no intermission.
Straight shot.
We're going to go straight shot. It should be an hour-long program.
Perfect.
The house doors open, and the audience filters in. Despite the COVID surge just weeks before the performance, well over 1,000 people attend.
Hello. Wow, you came. Thank you. They showed up.
Strangely, the concert seems almost anticlimactic. Ronald is deeply concerned with his entrance, not the grandness of it, but the actual route to the podium. Recall his terrible sense of direction. He's really anxious about how he's going to get from backstage to the front. Not that he'd be lost, but that he could wind up in a cul-de-sac of musicians and have to embarrassingly backtrack or wander. Over the course of the concert, Ronald makes multiple entrances, and he never uses the same path twice. He can memorize every note of his symphonic score, but how he walked 40 feet from backstage to the podium 10 minutes earlier, it just doesn't stick. Ronald has told me a number of times of an incident when he was conducting at Juilliard. He started the performance, and then he walked right off the stage, letting the musicians play by themselves. He meant it as a demonstration of his supreme confidence in them. For Ronald, all the important work is done before the concert. But today, Ronald will not walk off the stage, because he has achieved something in this concert that he relishes perhaps more than anything. He is conducting at one of the best concert halls in the world, but as himself, no longer hiding any part of who he is.
I realized this was the place that I want to be, except this time it's with the people I want to be. That was the magic moment for me, was when I realized that my tribe was on stage.
Caroline and Ronald will later say they never heard the orchestra play so well. And then all too quickly, it's over. The next morning, Ronald and Caroline are already hatching new ideas.
What about Carnegie?
Carnegie would be good too.
Okay.
But I would say we did Symphony Hall, Carnegie Hall, London, and then Berlin, which is where psychiatry originated with Sigmund Freud.
When I hear Ronald talking about where he wants to perform in the future, and that's my short list too, let's bring it to all the great concert halls. But then I think, how do we reach a broader society? God forbid, do we need to be dreaming about playing halftime at the Super Bowl?
The Super Bowl? Why not? Stranger things have happened.
Ronald is the reason that I feel like anything in this life is possible, because especially back then, he really just seemed to believe in anything, that anything could be turned into a positive experience, that we could do anything that we dreamed of.
As Ronald and Caroline chat about the future, I'm reminded of a moment 2 days earlier, the orchestra's first rehearsal at Symphony Hall. I had talked in Zoom with Ronald dozens of times, and I'd watched lots of recordings of him conducting, But this was the first time I had ever seen him on the podium in person. I am stunned. I never played in an orchestra, but even with no experience at all, it is immediately and screamingly evident that Ronald is a superman. I finally see what Caroline has always seen, what countless musicians have also seen. Ronald is a force of music, connectivity, and humanity that emanates from him with staggering power. It's not showy. There are no wild gesticulations, but he commands every molecule in the room. It's so stirring, my eyes well. I'm struck by Ronald's force, and I'm equally struck by how much he lost because of a lack of understanding of his mental illness. In some other world, Ronald's bipolar condition was understood and accepted. His career was all brilliance, and the number of students he reached was countless. But we are in this world. The path that brought him here has been so painful, and yet it brought him here, to his people and his home.
463, and I want it to go from loud and as soft as we can play.
The rehearsal goes on for 2 hours, but Ronald finishes with even more energy than he had at the beginning, and it seems that he could go for an eternity. While his feet have technically remained on the ground, it's perfectly clear that Ronald is flying. Anything is indeed possible. Thanks for listening. Me Too is the world's only classical music organization created for people living with a mental illness and those who support them. Their mission is to erase the stigma surrounding mental illness, both in practice and performance. They now have orchestras in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, as well as a chorus and a flute choir. To see their schedule, photos, videos, or learn so much more about them, go to their website at me2music.org. That's me2music.org. You can find that link in our show notes or at our website, brainstoriesproductions.com. Coming up on the next episode of Brain Stories, we're sticking with music, going behind the scenes to meet the man who wrote the original compositions for our series. He's brilliant, hilarious, and got into music with probably the most unlikely role model ever, the professional wrestler, Macho Man Randy Savage. I kid you not. Don't miss this packed parlay through pop culture and timeless symphonies, all of it at Paul Swartzel Velocity. Paul being our composer, and his velocity being Mach 5, give or take a Mach. Listen to it, beginning February the 12th. If you like the story you heard, shout it out. Tell your friends, family, colleagues, or anyone anywhere looking for a great rec. The best way someone can find out about Brain Stories is from you. And if you found this story moving, we want to know. Tell us what you liked, or if you've ever done something that left you with the understanding that there is so much power in just being with someone. You can email any of that to us at brainstoriesproductions@gmail.com. Thanks to the team that made this story possible. Our associate producer and editor was Kate Ruscosa. The highly original music came from Paul Swartzel. He has his own webpage, and yup, is the subject of our next episode. Karen Gibbon is our incredible story editor. The sound mixer who makes this all so sweet is Rob Byers. Executive produced by Frank Kosa and Janet Yang. A special thanks to our advisors, all our supporters, and to Eva Sahlberger of 7 Days and Stuck in Vermont for the use of her reporting. To Ronald, Caroline, and all the musicians of Me Too, we are eternally grateful. You can find a link in our episode notes to the entire concert they performed at Boston Symphony Hall. Check it out. It's perfect for working out, walking the dog, or anytime you want to hear some beautiful music. This show is a copyright of Brain Stories Productions and the San Bay Corporation. The use of this episode, or any of its content in or for any form of artificial intelligence, including training, is copyright infringement and expressly prohibited without prior written agreement.